Okay, today we've got the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Marcia Fudge. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to our conversation today.
Of course. Well, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so off the bat, we know that infrastructure talks between the president and Senator Shelley Moore Capito have broken down. And then we moved on to another round of talks with a bipartisan group of senators. And there's been some frustration because even with that first round of talks, the president went down $1 trillion, and yet Republicans only came up $150 billion. The bipartisan group of senators is already talking about skimping on raising taxes on corporations and on climate change, both of which should be absolute no-goes. So at what point will the White House say, okay, that's enough, we tried, time to get moving on this?
Well, I can't really speak for when that's going to happen, but I will say that there has been some progress. I mean, from the Senator Capito's group to this new group, the resource, I know that the offer has already come up. It's probably nowhere near where we want it to be right now. But until the president says it's time to pull the plug on bipartisanship, I'm in it all the way.
Are there worries the GOP is using bipartisanship as a stalling tactic just to run out the clock here?
I really can't speak to what the Republicans or the Democrats are thinking. My position is one that is neutral, but I would suggest that for both sides, we are running out of time to do some of the things that I know must get done. And I think that this president's jobs plan, or as what some call the infrastructure plan, is something that is long overdue. It is something the American people want to happen. It is something the American people want to happen now. And we've got to move it as quickly as we possibly can.
When would the reconciliation process need to begin if a bipartisan compromise isn't reached? Like, what's the red line here? Is there a specific date?
The only red line that the president has said is that the only red line is inaction altogether. But I would certainly hope that we would have some clear direction before the end of July. I think that kind of becomes the time frame in which we have to move legislation by the end of the year. So I don't know what the president is thinking, and I'm not speaking on his behalf at this point. I'm just saying to you that I think that it does need to occur fairly soon.
Okay. And now what are Americans poised to gain if the proposed infrastructure legislation does become law?
If this legislation becomes law, Brian, I can't tell you how strongly the American people are going to benefit. Just in housing, just in my own area alone, we're going to put more than $300 billion towards housing. We're talking about making properties that exist today more weatherproof, more resilient. We're talking about the intersection between public housing and climate. We are going to put more than $40 billion towards repair, upkeep, and resiliency of existing housing, build 2 million more new housing units over the next 5 years, put hundreds of thousands of people back to work. It is huge. The effects on this country are going to be so significant. I don't know that we will see anything like it in the past or in the future. This is the time that we have to make a real difference in how people live in this country.
Well, building on that, obviously, if you've taken a look at the housing market lately, you'd be pretty surprised with the meteoric rise of prices. I think most people wouldn't be too happy to see them, unless you're selling your house, in which case you'd be very happy to see those prices. But what does the American Jobs Plan do to help the average American be able to afford a home?
There are a number of things, Brian, that we are going to do to help with home ownership. We know that today, especially as it relates to minorities, that the gap in home ownership between Blacks and whites is as big as it was in 1968. Part of the problem is that in most communities, I don't think of any community right now that has what we're calling low income and moderate income housing. As you say, the prices have gone up 15%, 16%. They have become so expensive that the average person can no longer afford to buy a home. So what we are doing at HUD is going to assist people with homeowner down payment assistance. We are going to assist them with education. We're going to take a stronger look at how we address credit worthiness in this country, how we address some of the things that we know have been impediments. Because what we do know is that homeownership is the first step towards creating generational wealth, and we want to help people do it. It's just a shame, Brian, that there's no place in this country where a person making minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Nowhere in the entire United States. We don't have enough housing, at the level that the average person can buy it. So that is what the jobs plan is going to do. It's going to create that niche for that moderate and low income housing.
Yeah, and I think what's ironic about all of this too is that, you have the Republicans who are opposing the American Jobs Plan right now are opposing efforts to ultimately, by virtue of building that generational wealth, to bring people into the economy so that they can continue to stimulate the economy to help everybody make money. At the end of the day, this is only going to help everybody.
Everybody, you're absolutely right. We have so many people who have been locked out for so long that this is our opportunity. And I'm just really so pleased that the president has taken this kind of a courageous and bold and visionary look at where we are. Because you think about the numbers of homeless people, Brian. Not only do we have a problem with not having enough housing for people who can afford housing, think about the fact that we have on any given day, we know for sure in 2019, more than 580,000 people in this country were homeless.
Yeah.
We have a huge housing problem in this country.
Now, we've seen a number of climate disasters ravage homes and communities. Can you explain how this concept of resilient housing is going to help people stay safe?
Well, there is a requirement that the president has given us now, and I say requirement, not a request, that any housing that we build must take into consideration resiliency. The current housing that we have must be retrofitted and upgraded so that we can deal with the climate. Just think about it this way. If you live in a home, in an existing home, and you don't have the kind of weatherproofing in your home that you need, your utility bills become, some instances, more than your mortgage. And so what happens is that people who can barely get into a home, if their home does not have the kinds of safeguards that we want in terms of weatherization and meeting the climate situation, it's going to cost them so much they can't stay in their home.
We see this constant, this should be a given, right? Like we see this constant fatal short-termism pushed by Republicans. You remember when Trump was trying to push people away from getting light bulbs that lasted 4, 5, 6 times the amount of time as an old school light bulb, and it was just like, you have to stop pushing for this fatal short-termism just because it's something that we already have, and God forbid we have progress in any instance.
But the other thing we have to do is stop living in the past. Right. We have to start. We know things now that we didn't know 10 years ago about sustainability. We know things now about how to build more energy efficient homes. We know how to do it. We have the technology. We have the know-how. We have the people who can do it. We should stop living in the past and start looking toward the future of this country, not just for the next year or two, but the country that we're going to leave our children and our grandchildren. And if we don't start to look at that now, we may be too late in the long run to make a significant change in the way we live and work every day.
Well said. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit here. Is the White House lobbying Democratic holdouts like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema on the filibuster, given that H.R. 1 or even the Voting Rights Act won't pass with any Republican votes?
I don't know that I would consider it being lobbying, but I do understand that there are conversations with members of the Senate, those who are for and those who aren't sure where they stand. So I think they're talking to everybody on the Senate side as well as people on the House side. I mean, it's kind of like all hands on deck,
Right. I believe that Chuck Schumer has placed an August deadline on trying to pass H.R. 1. So, this is it's a 5-alarm fire, and we're getting even closer to it every day.
Well, I do know that he is determined to put it on the House floor. He has said that publicly. And so I hope that he will follow through with what he's saying. I think it's important.
A major talking point that we hear on the right is that there's inflation. And look, the cost of a banana could go up 3 cents and Fox News would be crying inflation for 2 months straight. So I'm definitely not trying to legitimize or validate these talking points, but I think that taking the opportunity to counter this disinformation is important. So what's your response to warnings about inflation?
Well, I'm not in the least bit worried about inflation, and I don't think most economists are either. I think that is just a diversion, a distraction. And I don't know who's saying it, but I don't know of any economists who are especially worried. We may, in fact, have some inflation, but it will not be significant enough for us to not do the things that this administration is doing. We have to continue to move forward, Brian. And so as you look at us opening up our society right now, that is what our goal is to get people back to as close as we could to normal, to make people's lives better, to deal with the poverty and to deal with the joblessness that we see in this country. So if we can turn things around, we're not really that concerned about a small amount of inflation, if in fact it even happens. There is nothing definitive to say to us that it's going to be a problem.
Especially, a lot of these attacks are amid the American Jobs Plan, where the benefits of that plan so far outweighed any potential disadvantages or any warnings that were brought forward by Republicans. You look at the number of Americans who've been pulled out of poverty, who've been able, the massive number of Republicans who have escaped, hunger. It's been incredible.
Well, I would just say this to you, Brian. When I was a member of Congress, the Congress of the United States passed a $2 trillion cut in taxes for the wealthiest people in this country. I certainly do believe that we need to give the same kind of consideration to helping the people who are most in need in this country.
Perfectly put. Well, Secretary Fudge, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed speaking with you today.